Welcome to Midweek Experiments in Faithfulness. This is a weekly facilitated spiritual practice with a Quaker flavor and an experiential ethos. My name is Brent, and I'm the Program and Engagement Manager here at Beacon Hill Friends House, which is a Quaker center for learning and action and a residential community of about 20 people who live according to Quaker values. Tonight, we have May Hasbrook and Jen Newman with the practice ReWilding Quakers, Prism Vision. ReWilding Quakers is a three-part series, and this is the final of those three parts of experiential living practice to stir our hope, joy, and communal care. This practice is to reinvigorate us beyond extraordinary respectability into embodied memories of being courageous in our present. Prism Vision is a session about carrying the entirety of ourselves as a pathway for caring, courageous Quaker community. May and Jen will help us explore multi-visions for today from a poetic source about first friends. So now I'm excited to introduce to you May and Jen. May resides on Wabanaki lands in Lewiston, Maine, and is active with Three Rivers Monthly Meeting. Her past creative projects spanned Michigan, Peru, and the British Isles. She also traveled in ministry among world friends. And these days, May is steeped in repair work as a daily choice and a collaborative journey that carries divine promise. She draws up experiences as a survivor of violence, nearing 17 years of sobriety, and identity recovery as a person of mixed lineage. In this series, May offers a frame of generative life-giving practices informed by seasoned community work in diverse contexts, including Quakers of the U.S. Northeast. Jen Newman became the executive director of Beacon Hill Friends House in April of 2023. She is queer, a Quaker, and holds a Master of Theological Studies from Vanderbilt Divinity School, where she focused her studies on religion, gender, and sexuality. So May and Jen, it is all yours.
Welcome everyone in the room and on Zoom. And there is a lot going on in the world. And so it's really precious to have each of you join. And Jen and I began a exchange about this series early in the year. And when we had that conversation, I said, Jen, would you join me on the last one? I could come in person. And I'd like you to come, as you. Like, I know you have this director hat, but the wish was to have Jen come and be a co-contributor from the rich perspective and experience that she brings. So I'm really excited to get to try a new thing with her here at the house. So Prism Vision was inspired through this exchange Jen and I were having about the light, talking about it in Quaker terms of this inward divine or this precious sense of being that we all carry, and that many times in these conversations the light gets simplified or reduced to like this one dimensional thing, this phrase, the light. And so we were discussing the light in terms of the experience of a prism, and that how the light moves through and is generating these colors and has these angles, and depending where you're sitting in relationship to the prism, that you have a different encounter with it, and that people sharing the same moment in different spots with that prism and that light, and the weather bringing in different light, that those would all be coexisting experiences of light. And that this would also be coexisting experiences of divine, but that our stories often about each other, and in Quaker history and present for that matter, but looking backwards often get flattened, dimensionalized to this surface of a one thing. And so we wanted to explore the prism as a way to expand the ways that we tend to narrow our understanding of our own experience, and those who we're in relationship with, and those that we look back at with Quakers and for our here and now. So that was kind of our way in to the prism. So we hope that we're going to have a creative activity later, reading from a wonderful work from an English poet who now isn't around anymore, but inspired around the life of James Naylor and contemporaries of that time. We'll come to that later. But first, we're going to have some back and forth with Jen and I around the theme for tonight in context of rewilding Quakers. And we will work our way towards our creative part of the evening. So Jen, I think at this point you were going to do some sharing around rewilding Quakers with this Prism Vision and your own journey with like how this topic came to light.
Yeah, there are many entry points to this piece, but when we started having a conversation around what might we do around World Quaker Day and the celebration of George Fox's 400th birthday. And that was an invitation from friends around the world to consider sort of the Quaker message in the world now and what we have to bring. And we started talking, though, about how in my role in my life, I'm often asked to talk about the story of Quakerism. So how did Quakers come to be? What do we believe? And a lot of it is, some narratives are George Fox founded Quakerism, and that George Fox is sort of the founder. And I hear that a lot from folks who are maybe new to Quakerism. And I think the celebration of George Fox's 400th birthday for folks who don't know much about the story of Quakerism as a movement for people can seem like, oh, we're celebrating the founder of Quakerism's 400th birthday, which isn't the real, I think, invitation here. And so we started thinking about what about that kind of celebration leads folks into a flattened narrative of what Quakerism is and how it originated. So how can we think about Quakerism outside of a flattened narrative from here is this one person who had this idea, who did this thing. And so that story, for folks who might not know, is just that George Fox was about 27 years old and had a vision around a people gathered. And so the idea that this one person had this vision that Quakerism could exist and that there's that of God in every person isn't quite the narrative. And so we started talking about some of May's work. And when May and I met, I was 24 and new in a role with Beacon Hill Friends House out of Divinity School, and thinking about the Valiant 60, or how do we talk about Quakerism as a movement of people. And so we came out of that conversation with something else that moves me into Quakerism, which is, how do I put this? So Brent read that I studied religion, gender, and sexuality studies in graduate school and divinity school. But one of the things that I studied was this concept of theologies of multiplicity. So in philosophy, you might say that there's a history in Western philosophy of the logic of the one, that we're looking for one capital T truth. Or we're looking for one, like ultimately underneath everything, there is kind of a one thing that we're trying to find. And a theology of multiplicity, or a concept of multiplicity, is a rejection that there is one at the root of everything, but rather that there is the multiple, and the multiple is. And so it's not something that you're trying to flatten into a one thing or to dig through and find the one thing that's there, but that we can hold that the multiple is what is. And I like that in terms of the prism or the rainbow, that we might see the light as one thing, but that's just our perception of that light as one thing. In fact, if you look at it in depth, it's actually many multiple things, and that is what is. So it's not better that we perceive the light as one thing, but it's just a limit to our perception in that moment. And then in fact, what exists is this diverse multiple. And so when we think about the theology of the light, we might understand that as an invitation to consider holding the multiple. And I think about that when we think about telling our collective story. So telling the story, how I might share the story of Quakerism with someone who is new to it, or how I might talk about the 400th celebration of George Fox's birthday, but not tell it in a way that flattens the truth of Quakerism being a movement of people, of which had many different experiences and many different varied experiences, some of which in hindsight, when we look back, we don't tell in their entirety, or maybe haven't, or we've lost some histories here. And so what are the ways that we can continue to look back and turn that prism around and try to understand it from multiple different vantage points of what Quakerism is in depth? And I think about that too, in terms of the stories that we tell about ourselves, or the understandings that we have about ourselves, that there are deep pieces to my own story, like spiritual journey that I might tell in certain circumstances and not in others, that are complex and varied and even, counterintuitive or contradictory, because we're people and that's part of our own deep story. And so just like the prism contains the multitude, I may choose in a moment to flatten my own narrative and share just a piece of that story. Like you might hear, I'm the executive director of Beacon Hill Friends House, and I did this thing, and I went to divinity school, but none of that was a straight line for me. And my own spiritual journey is quite varied, and we can talk about that too if it opens up to it. But to understand that we ourselves are complex and contain multiple, and that is what is. And so we're not looking to try to not understand those pieces of our narrative, but what does it look like to hold? And I find, I'll say one more piece and then I'll turn it back over to May to think about it. But one of the things that draws me to Quaker worship, especially unprogrammed or waiting worship, where we wait in silence, expectant waiting to see what we might have to bring forth as a group, that from spirit or God or whatever language you want to put there that's meaningful to you. For me, it's spirit. That someone may give a message that feels totally different from what I'm thinking in that moment or needing, and that can be a teacher for me. And we can hold all of these pieces and messages and what we're experiencing, and that each person in that silence is experiencing something really different and deep for them or not. And that we worship can kind of be a container to hold that multiple, and that's what's good, is a powerful thing for me, rather than trying to make sure that every person in the room is believing the same thing, that we can hold that depth in that practice. And so that's part of what draws me, I think, into that Quaker practice, into the Quaker story. And so, or stories. That's one of the things. So that's some of where our conversation ended up going in this piece. Is there anything else you want to bring forth, May?
Well, just to segue that, Rich kind of theory, idea, context, but it is steeped in daily living, and that's the bridging that we're going to do. And so we're going to take that part of the story and connect it with some of this poetic text that shows us this multiplicity that Jen was just sharing. It also speaks to inwardly, if we look at our own lives, we heard in our introductions some layers to who we are. And sometimes we name those out loud, sometimes we don't. And we are not one thing either. We are many facets. And we can often in our own relationships kind of attach a certain attribute to someone, including ourselves. And that's a story we carry or carry about someone. And this can get in the way of our relationships and healing. And this can also be openings to learn something new, or be like, oh, how does someone else come about to the same experience that was quite different for me? So in this session, like, there's been a list of materials recommended. You may or not have gathered those where you are. I want to give folks in the room a chance that there's a table with some supplies, and that we have a table set up that's a working space. So there's paper on the working table here. If you want to work with paper, you're welcome to grab some. It was a bring your own kind of packet tonight, but here in the room I have some supplies I brought that you can work with. Don't have to, but the invitation is going to be making something of a creative nature. It was a DIY design prompt while this text is read out. So I want to give people a chance to select what they might like to use from the room here, or if you needed to grab something, whether it's just a form with a simple paper and writing instrument, or if you have some fabric around. I also brought fabric here for people to attach things. So as you would like.
Yeah, why don't we give folks a minute
Yeah, so get a
situated.
moment to grab your things, and while you're grabbing your things, I would say that this text selected, the little preview for the text I'll be reading is from the First Friends. That's where it's steeped historically. This James Naylor is also known as the Quakers' Christ or Jesus, in that through some cultural challenges and breaking the rules with some other persons, they were imprisoned, and he suffered a pretty harsh sentence. There was the wish to actually put him to death, but they didn't go that far. But it greatly reduced his lifespan because it was physically very damaging. But the story around James Naylor is that there was a group of women who found him a great listener and responder to the things that they carried as concerns. And what this poetic epic poem does by Dorothy Nimmo, an English writer, is it takes the more prevailing story about these first friends and breaks it open and brings forward voices that we don't necessarily have documentation for. And in terms of our own lives, where we are often silenced or suppressed, which is an experience that I have had the past year in particular in certain Quaker circles. And I'm feeling really grateful for the friends who are here tonight, who've been accompanying and supporting me, Becky Jones, Jonathan Vogelborn. And these are accompaniment options in order to bring out experiences that otherwise would not be brought to light. So this text does this contrasting. And so Jen and I were going to read a segment and invite you to be creating while you take it in. After we do the reading, we'll check and see, but I think that will be the time to kind of stop the practice and do our sharing, which the recording will be off for. So this is from Dorothy Nimmo's A Testimony to the Grace of God as Shown in the Life of James Naylor. Dates were 1618 to 1660. We're just reading one portion.
Oh, and I'm going to share it on the screen so folks can follow along if that's helpful. We're reading 17.
Women are making disturbances. Women are becoming hysterical. They speak constantly in our meetings of childish things, childishly.
We are thy lambs, James. We feel the power of the Lord in thee, and it is beautiful. Thy voice touches our hearts. Our hearts yearn towards thee. Feed thy lambs, James.
Feed not on knowledge, Martha, Dorcas, Judy, Rebecca, Hannah, Jane. For whoever feeds on knowledge dies to the innocent life.
But we are hungry. We are moved of the Spirit. Look how we quake and tremble. The Spirit moves us to speak, to sing, to tremble. How should we be silent?
Martha Simmons fell to singing in an unclean spirit. The substance of what she sang was innocency, innocency, many times over for the space of an hour or more.
Innocency, a pure flower, A white sheet folded over and over, clear starch, fresh from the press, laid on the marriage bed. Innocency, as it was in the beginning, with a fresh smell like creation, like the smell of fresh blood. Innocent as the leaves after rain, as the fine, soft hair of the newborn. Innocency in the nature of all creatures, all things working together. Oh, James, is there not a unity in creation and all things whole and wholly new? Holy, holy, holy in the high places, deep within, full of the sound of silence, full of the taste of yourself, and the sound of the blood flowing, the beating of the heart, the emptiness of the shell, full of the sound of the sea, and light sounding like a trumpet in darkness. Oh, let it all go. Let all fall through your fingers like a blessing, like warm sand, like soft rain, like the long, soft rain after a long drought soaking the roots.
Martha Simmons, thou speaks in thine own will. Thou seeks dominion. Thou is run forth to utter words without knowledge. Go home and mind thy calling.
Richard Huberthorne says I must be silent. Must I be silent, James? Must I not speak? Is there not that of God in me? Do you not hear the voice of God singing in Paradise Garden? Time to come home, dear child, nightfall, time for bed. Mother, godmother, mother of God, do you not hear her voice? Lead me, James. Give me a leading. I look for judgment.
But James is silent. James is weeping.
I looked for judgment, and behold a cry. Behold a cry, and behold an oppression.
So that is the section from Dorothy Nimmo's epic poem about James Naylor and adjacent persons to that experience. Thank you for attempting and doing the creative invitation of your DIY design. We are going to allow you to keep making. We're going to stop the recording here in a moment, and we can continue to create as we're sharing here in the room and on Zoom.